There is a kind of person who looks at the world and sees it not as it is, but as it could be. Most people find this exhausting. They prefer the world as it is. It is safer that way, more comfortable, more predictable. But every once in a while, one of these people refuses to stop seeing, and that refusal, that stubborn, inconvenient, sometimes maddening refusal, changes everything. This is the story of Ethan Cross. Ethan was 17 years old when his high school teacher told him in front of the entire class that he was too distracted to amount to anything. He had been staring out the window during a history lesson, not daydreaming, thinking. There was a difference, though the teacher did not see it. He was thinking about machines. Specifically, he was thinking about why machines were designed to think like engineers instead of like people. He walked home from school that afternoon the long way, through the old part of town, past the electronics repair shop on Maple Street, where a man named Harold always had the door propped open and machines in various states of being taken apart spread across a workbench. He had been stopping here for 2 years, not to buy anything, to watch. He watched Harold's hands, the way they moved through a broken radio or a cracked television with the same confidence that a musician moves through a familiar song. Harold never seemed to guess, he always seemed to know. "How do you always know what's wrong?" Ethan asked once. Harold didn't look up from the circuit board in his hands. "Everything broken is trying to tell you something," he said. "You just have to be quiet enough to listen." Ethan never forgot that. That evening, Ethan sat on the floor of his bedroom, which looked less like a teenager's room and more like a small laboratory, surrounded by the pieces of a computer he had bought at a yard sale for $12. It didn't work. That was exactly why he bought it. He was going to make it work. 3 days later, he did. His parents scraped together everything they had, every saved dollar, every deferred expense, every quiet sacrifice to send Ethan to college. His mother cried at the campus gate, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming, chest-tightening feeling of watching something you have believed in for a long time finally begin. His father shook his hand, one firm handshake, no speech, no long words, just the handshake, which for Daniel Cross said everything. Ethan studied computer science, and for the first 6 months, he was genuinely happy. But happiness for people like Ethan is often a temporary condition, because happiness requires stillness, and Ethan's mind was constitutionally incapable of being still. By the middle of his second year, Ethan had begun skipping lectures. Not to sleep, not to party, he was in the computer lab, sometimes for 18 hours at a time, working on something that had no assignment attached to it, no grade, no professor waiting for it. He was building a program that let a computer display information in a way that felt like talking to a person, not reading a manual. His professor told him to focus on what was on the syllabus. Ethan nodded politely, then he went back to the computer lab. The call came in October of his sophomore year. His father had been laid off. The family savings, already thin, were now nearly gone. Ethan sat with that news for 3 days. Then he walked into the registrar's office and withdrew from the university. He did not tell his parents immediately. He sat on a park bench outside the university for 2 hours first. He watched students walk past, backpacks on, coffees in hand, futures apparently very clear. He opened his notebook and wrote one sentence at the top of an empty page. "If not now, when? If not me, who?" Then he closed the notebook, stood up, and called his mother. She was quiet for a long time after he told her. Then she said, "Come home, Ethan. We'll figure it out." He had heard those words before, from other mothers in other stories, but hearing them from your own mother when you are 19 years old and terrified is something very different. The garage at 14 Willow Creek Drive became the most important room in Ethan's world. It belonged to his parents. It smelled like engine oil and old cardboard. The floor was concrete. There was one folding table, 2 mismatched chairs, an extension cord running from the house, and a small electric heater that worked only when it felt like it. But to Ethan and Marcus, it was everything. Marcus Webb had been Ethan's best friend since the 7th grade. He was the opposite of Ethan in almost every way: patient where Ethan was urgent, methodical where Ethan was instinctive, optimistic in a grounded, practical way where Ethan was optimistic in a burning, slightly unreasonable way. They were, together, one complete mind. What they were building was called Intuos. The name came from the word intuitive. Ethan's core belief, the belief that had started in that high school classroom when he should have been taking history notes, was this: technology should feel like a natural extension of a human being. Not a tool you have to study, not a machine you have to speak to in its own language, something you simply pick up and understand immediately. In 1985, this was a radical idea. Most computers of that era were designed by engineers for engineers. They were powerful and cold and deeply indifferent to the person sitting in front of them. The relationship between human and machine was one of submission. The human had to adapt. The human had to learn. Ethan wanted to reverse that entirely. The machine, he said, should do the adapting. They worked like that for 2 years. 18-hour days, cold winters in a garage with a heater that gave up in February. Summers so hot that solder sometimes melted before they intended it to. There were weeks when they had no groceries for groceries, and Ethan's mother quietly left bags of food outside the garage door without knocking, because she knew her son would argue about it. She was right, he would have. By 1987, they had a working prototype. It was not perfect, but it was real. And when you showed it to people, ordinary people, not engineers, not programmers, and watched their faces as they understood it in 30 seconds, you knew that something important had been born in that garage. They showed Intuos for the first time at a regional technology conference in San Francisco in the spring of 1987. They had no booth budget. Ethan had borrowed a folding table from his neighbor. Marcus had made the banner by hand the night before. Their suits, the only suits they owned, had been ironed 3 times each. What happened in the next 45 minutes was the closest thing to magic that either of them had ever experienced. People stopped, people stared, people called other people over. A crowd formed. By the middle of the afternoon, there was a line 15 people long waiting to try a computer that responded to them like a person, not like a machine. An older man in a gray suit, a venture capitalist named George Whitfield, who had seen 1,000 product demonstrations and been impressed by almost none of them, stood at the back of the crowd and watched. He watched for 20 minutes without moving. Then he walked directly up to Ethan and said 4 words, "How much do you need?" Ethan looked at the man. He had rehearsed this answer 1,000 times. "Enough to build it properly," he said, "not $1 more." George Whitfield blinked. In 20 years of investing, he had never received that particular answer. "You're not going to give me a number?" Ethan said. "The number changes every day based on what we learn, but our direction doesn't. "Give me 6 months and I'll show you what it becomes." George stared at him for a long moment. Then he smiled, slowly, with recognition. "I've met 3 people in my life who spoke like that. All 3 changed the industry they were in." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "Monday morning, 9 o'clock. Don't be late." Intuos Corporation opened its first real office in Palo Alto in 1989. It had 12 employees. Ethan was 24 years old. Marcus ran engineering. Ethan ran everything else, which meant that Ethan ran the product, the design, the marketing, the investor meetings, the hiring decisions, and the company culture. He was not always easy to work for. He held a standard for the product, for the team, for every detail that exhausted some people and electrified others. He sent back designs that were 90% perfect because the remaining 10% was still visible to someone paying attention. He sat in on engineering meetings not to micromanage, but because he needed to understand every decision that touched the product. The product is not a collection of features. The product is an experience. Every single element, the way a window opens, the sound a key makes, the color we chose for this button, is part of that experience. There are no unimportant details. In 1992, Intuos launched its first consumer product, a personal computer called the Nova. Nothing like it had existed before. It came in a single piece, monitor, computer, and speakers unified in a design that looked less like a machine and more like something that belonged in a home. It came in 4 colors. The interface was so simple that a 10-year-old and a 60-year-old could sit down and understand it in the same amount of time. The tech press called it elegant. Competitors called it impractical. The public bought 300,000 units in the first month. For 3 years, everything Ethan had believed, everything he had worked towards since that bedroom floor covered in yard sale computer parts, seemed to be coming true. The company grew, the product improved, the team expanded. The world was beginning to change in the exact direction Ethan had always seen it going. And then, the board of directors hired a new chief executive officer. His name was Victor Hale. He was brought in by the board in 1994 to professionalize Intuos's operations, to scale the company, to optimize for profit. These are words that sound very reasonable in a boardroom. They often mean something else entirely on the ground. Ethan and Victor disagreed on almost everything. Victor wanted to cut the design budget and increase production volume. Ethan said design was not a budget line. It was the entire reason the product existed. Victor said Ethan was too emotional about the technology. Ethan said Victor did not understand what they were building. Both were probably right about each other. The vote happened on a Tuesday in March 1995. Ethan was not told about it in advance. He arrived at the office that morning the same way he always did, early, coffee in hand, already thinking about 3 problems simultaneously. His assistant met him in the lobby. Her face told him before her words did. He was walked to the boardroom. Victor was there. 7 board members were there. The company's legal counsel was there. The vote had been 11-1. The 1 was Marcus, who had been the only person in that room who understood what was truly being taken away. Ethan was removed from operational control of the company he had built in his parents' garage. He walked out of that building at 11:47 in the morning. He sat in his car. he did not start it. For a very long time, he simply sat there, in the parking lot of the company he had founded, staring at the building whose every detail he had fought for, and felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since he was 19 years old on a park bench. He felt lost. The months that followed were the hardest of life for Ethan, not because he was poor, not because he was unknown, but because for the first time in 15 years, he woke up in the morning with no urgent problem to solve, no product to fight for, no team waiting for his direction. For a person whose entire identity had been built around building, this was a particular kind of silence that felt like drowning. He took long walks, he read, he visited old bookshops and sat in coffee shops for hours. He cooked, badly but intentionally. He traveled to Japan and spent 3 weeks visiting design studios, gardens, and small technology companies. He sat in a Zen garden in Kyoto for 4 hours and thought about negative space, about the idea that what you remove from something is as important as what you put in. He began to understand that being removed from intuos was the most important education of his life. He also met Clara. Clara Nguyen was a product designer at a small company in San Francisco. They met at a lecture on the intersection of art and technology, the kind of event that only a very specific kind of person attends on a Tuesday evening. She disagreed with something Ethan said during the Q&A, publicly, clearly, without any apparent awareness of or interest in who he was. He found this entirely irresistible. They talked for 3 hours after the lecture ended. Then they talked for 3 hours more the following evening, and the evening after that. Clara did not treat Ethan as a legend or a cautionary tale or a business case study. She treated him as a person, which during that particular period of his life was the most radical thing anyone could have offered him. In 1998, Intuos called Ethan back. Victor Hale's strategy had failed. The cost-cutting had hollowed out the products. The licensed operating system had created a confusing ecosystem of mediocre machines that shared Intuos's name, but none of its soul. The stock had collapsed. The team that had built the company's best work had left because the thing they had been building for was no longer there. The board, humbled and desperate, contacted Ethan through an intermediary. He took 3 days to respond. Then he called them directly, not the intermediary, the board, and he said one thing: "I will come back, but we do this my way, completely. No compromises on the product, no committees approving design decisions. If you want me, that is the deal." They agreed. The first thing Ethan did when he returned was walk through every floor of the building. He looked at every product they were making, every interface, every design decision. He took notes. Then he called a company-wide meeting. Every employee, from the engineers to the reception staff, gathered in the main atrium. Ethan stood in the center. He did not use a microphone. He spoke so that only the people paying full attention could hear him, which meant everyone paid full attention. He said, "We forgot what we are for. We are not for the shareholders. We are not for the analysts. We are for the person who picks up one of our products and wants it to change the way they live. That person is who we go back to work for, starting today." The applause lasted 4 minutes. Marcus, who had stayed through all of it, holding the engineering team together by sheer personal loyalty, was in the third row. He was not applauding. He was just looking at his old friend with an expression that said, "You're back, finally." For 2 years after his return, Ethan worked on a project so secret that it had no name inside the company. People called it simply the project. It was the culmination of everything, every idea that had started in that high school classroom, every night in the garage, every argument with Victor Hale, every quiet afternoon in a Japanese Zen garden, every conversation with Clara, every year of distance that had clarified what he truly believed. The project was a device that fit in your hand. It was a computer that did not look like a computer. It did not have buttons. It did not have a keyboard. It had a single glass surface, and it responded to the touch of a human finger. Every single interface element, every icon, every transition, every sound, every animation had been refined hundreds of times. Nothing had been left to chance. Nothing had been accepted as good enough. When it was done, Ethan held it and said to the team, Now it is ready." The launch event was held in February 2001. 1,200 people in a theater in San Francisco, press from 40 countries, an industry that had largely written into us as a nostalgia brand, investors who were there more out of habit than expectation. Ethan walked on stage in his dark jeans and black mock-necked shirt, the same way he always dressed, the way he had always dressed, because he had long ago decided that the details of his clothing would never compete for attention with the details of his work. He stood at the center of the stage under a single spotlight. He said, "Every once in a while, a product comes along that doesn't just improve on what came before, it changes what is possible. We believe this is one of those moments." Then he reached into his pocket and showed the world the mirror. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then the theater erupted. The mirror sold 1 million units in its first week. It changed not just the company, but the entire technology industry. Within 2 years, the concept Ethan had been pursuing since he was 17 years old, technology that thinks like a person, had become the standard that every other company in the world was trying to follow. His parents drove up to San Francisco a month after the launch. His father, Daniel, still broad-shouldered, still a man of very few words, walked through Intuos headquarters with Ethan. He looked at the products, he looked at the people, he looked at his son. At the end of the tour, he stopped in the atrium. He put his hand on Ethan's shoulder, said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I always knew." That was it, 3 words, and yet Ethan later said it was the most important sentence anyone had ever said to him. Marcus, who had stayed with the company through its worst years, who had been the one vote against Ethan's removal, who had rebuilt the engineering team from nothing during the wilderness years, was made president of engineering after the Mira launch. At the celebration dinner that night, when it was his turn to speak, he raised his glass and said, "Ethan once told me in a freezing cold garage in 1986 that one day we would build something that every person on Earth would want to hold in their hand. I thought he was insane. I built it with him anyway. That's what friendship is." Everyone laughed, including Ethan.
People ask, what is the lesson of a life like Ethan Cross's? Is it about talent? He would tell you talent without obsession is just potential, and potential is only interesting if you do something with it. Is it about timing? He would say timing is a story people tell after the fact. While you are living it, there is no timing. There is only the work. Is it about resilience? Getting fired from your own company and coming back to build something greater? Yes, but that framing misses something. because Ethan did not come back to prove anyone wrong. He came back because the work was unfinished, because the idea that had started in a high school classroom, that had survived 2 years in a freezing garage, that had survived an industry that did not yet understand it, that idea was still there, still waiting. The lesson is not that everything works out in the end. The lesson is what happens in the middle. The middle is the dropout walking away from the campus gate. The middle is the 2 young men in a freezing garage at 2 in the morning arguing about whether the color of an icon matters. The middle is the parking lot, sitting alone in a car that isn't moving, outside a building that used to be yours. The middle is the Zen garden, the long walks, the years of not knowing. The middle is where most people stop. And that, exactly that, is why most people are not Ethan Kross. Not because they lacked the talent, not because they lacked the opportunity, but because the middle asked them to keep going when keeping going made no logical sense at all. And they chose, reasonably, understandably, humanly, to stop. Ethan Kross kept a notebook his entire life. On the first page of every new notebook, from the one he started at 16 in his bedroom to the ones he filled at the design studio in his 40s, he wrote the same sentence. The sentence he had written on that park bench at 19. The sentence that had gotten him back into the car, back on the plane, back into the building, back onto the stage. If not now, when? If not me, who? You will be told, at school, at work, by people who love you and people who don't, that your dream is too big, too different, too slow, too strange, or simply too much. Listen to them carefully, thank them genuinely, and then go back to work. The world does not reward people who dream. It rewards people who dream and then get up at 4 in the morning anyway, who work in freezing garages anyway, who get fired and sit in parking lots and cry, and then go home and open the notebook anyway. Your idea is not the problem. Your timeline is not the problem. The only real question, the one that separates the people who build things from the people who wished they had, is simply this: how much of the middle are you willing to live through?